Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief because we've got a terrific panel, and let me say what an honor it is to be part of this discussion, and I appreciate the initial comments. So I found many points to agree with in the opening statements by Kurt and Pan Jinqing, and some with which to disagree. So let me try to make 4 or 5 points very quickly. First, I applaud President Xi Jinping for raising at the recent summit an issue much more fundamental than the disputes over trade and cyber and climate and currencies, but for digging deeper by remembering an ancient Greek historian, Thucydides. And I think that by doing this, he began a conversation about deeper fundamentals in the relationship that I hope will engage more of the governments and the societies. In particular, if you didn't follow all of the back and forth, when Xi Jinping arrived in Seattle and gave his only public speech, he said, quote, "There is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world." But then he warned, quote, "Should major countries time and again make the mistakes of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves." By the time he got to Washington, in my view, he had become a little more precise in his articulation. So at the state lunch that Vice President Biden and Secretary Kerry hosted, he said, "I believe we can escape Thucydides' trap," which seems to be closer to the mark, in my view. And then President Obama picked up this issue in their one-on-one, in their bilateral, and here's what President Obama said. He said, quote, "I don't agree with the interpretation of Thucydides' trap that an established power must have a conflict with an emerging power. Major powers like China and the U.S. must prevent conflicts as much as possible. I believe the two countries are capable of managing these disagreements," close quote. Now, again, I would say that's even closer to my understanding of the reality. So that's point one. Point two, Thucydides' trap, I believe, is the best lens available for illuminating what's happening in the relationship between the U.S. and China today and for the next generation. So if you compare any other concept or conceptualization about this relationship, I argue, and this is argued at an article length in the current Atlantic, that this is the best lens available for illuminating what's happening in the relationship between China and the U.S. I coined this metaphor several years ago, but the insight, of course, was Thucydides, who, observing the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece, said famously, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable." Now, historians have had or interpreters, an argument for a long time about, well, what did he mean by inevitable? In my interpretation, I believe this was hyperbole for Thucydides. That is exaggeration for the point of emphasis, that he was saying not 100% inevitable, just very likely if given business as usual. But in any case, what he pointed to And this, I think, is a point in which I disagree with comments that were just made. I disagree. And I disagree with President Xi's first articulation of this. What is inevitable about the rise of a power that threatens to displace a ruling power is severe structural stress. So let me say it again. When a rising power threatens to disrupt a ruling power, expect trouble. There will be severe structural stress, almost as a rule of international politics. Now, I can imagine the rise of a power relative to the rule of a power, and the ruling power was perhaps Mother Teresa. But we haven't seen one of those in history. And I could imagine that the rising power was Mother Teresa, but we haven't seen that either. So I would say the insight about severe structural stress being a condition of the relationship is correct. What is not inevitable, in my view, and in my analysis of Thucydides' argument, is that these underlying conditions, which are inevitably stressful, inevitably lead to war. So I have been making a study of this over the last several years that's taken longer than I would like, but we put up on the Belfer Center at Harvard's website the Thucydides trap case file. And in what's now 16 cases over the last 500 years, in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power, the outcome was war. In 12 of the 16 cases, in 4, not so. Actually, I brought maybe you can just send that around for people that are interested. This is just, you can see this on the website at Harvard Belfer Center, the 16 cases where we describe the cases and where we try to foot them in the authoritative accounts of the history of the periods in which there was a rising power rivaling a ruling power. So maybe I'll just make one more point. If we look at the purpose of this exercise is not a statistical study. This is not an effort of a political scientist to try to find some way to put some numbers on something for the purpose of satisfying current practices in political science. This is meant to be a practical inquiry from a policy perspective of the phenomenon of what happens with rising and ruling powers. So we're very interested in additional cases and in debate about these cases. And I wouldn't feel terrible if we knocked 2 off and got 4 more. I'm interested in what happens in this that happens more as natural consequences of rise versus rule. But I would say, again, slightly disagreeing with some of what was suggested, it is inescapable that a rising power, I believe, who becomes more powerful, believes that its interests deserve more weight. It believes that it deserves more say and sway in the resolution of conflicts. And it's virtually inevitable that a ruling power will find the pressure, the assertiveness and aggressiveness of a rising power threatening, especially to the status quo that the ruling power has created, which were the conditions in which the rising power rose. And for Americans who usually have trouble with this idea, I have a little section, which is actually a chapter in the book that will eventually be, on God forbid if China were, quote, just like us. So Americans love to give lectures to Chinese and everybody else about why Chinese should behave like we did. But if you look back at the story of the rise of the U.S. to rival Britain 100 years ago about now, actually the personification of that rise was one of my heroes, Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt's view was that as long as Spain in the first instance and Britain in the second instance and third any other Europeans were in our hemisphere, there would never be what Chinese would call harmony, what he called natural condition. And he proceeded in the course of a couple of decades to first build up the U.S. Navy, take advantage of an opportunity to have a Spanish-American War, which when the U.S. defeated Spain, Spain was out of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and indeed Guam, to threaten war with both Britain and Germany over a territorial dispute in Venezuela, to sponsor a coup in Honduras and create a new country called Panama, which gave the U.S. the contract for the Panama Canal, and indeed to threaten war with Britain over a territorial dispute in Canada, which became the fat tail of Alaska. If you look at this 500 miles that separates Canada from the sea, where I was fishing this past summer in the Tongass National Forest. Now, I would say if China behaved, quote, just like us, this relationship will turn out very, very, very badly. So the importance, I believe, of looking at Thucydides' trap is, as Santayana told us, that only those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. So I think if we examine the history, we can get many clues and suggestions to how this generation of leadership in China and the U.S. may succeed in bending the arc of history.
Thank you for a model presentation.
The program says that Charles Freeman is here, and for those of you who are expecting to see my son, I apologize. I'm his father, Chaz. He's called Charles, I'm called Chaz. 他叫傅瑞伟, 我叫傅立民. And so I really enjoyed Kurt's psychoanalysis of the United States. I'm sorry he's not here. I noted that he was somewhat defensive about what the pivot is not. I would have liked to have heard something about what it is, frankly. And I suspect the Chinese president would have enjoyed that, too. He did make the point that Asia is important, and I agree with that. The Indo-Pacific has emerged as the global center of economic gravity, and so refocusing American attention to it makes sense. But even though the region's increased influence at the global level is not political and is only marginally military, the rebalance is almost entirely military. Its economic element, TPP, apparently concluded this morning, although we don't know what's in it, looks like an afterthought premised on denial of the entrenched centrality of China in the regional supply chain economy. And the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia lacks a coherent diplomatic component. So, not to mince words, I seldom do, the focus, which is why I don't want to be confused with my son because he has enough trouble already, not to mince words, a focus on Asia makes sense, but the way U.S. attention is being shifted there does not. The rebalance will not work. Far from avoiding the so-called Thucydides trap, and by the way, I'm grateful for Graham Allison's presence. Thucydides discovered the trap, Graham discovered Thucydides, and
He was there way first.
But far from avoiding the Thucydides trap, this rebalance walks right into it. It's likely to be seen in retrospect as an historic blunder that did not so much deter war as lay the basis for it. First, a rebalance aimed at sustaining American dominance in Asia is military fantasy. It posits a perpetual American upper hand in a contest with China to control areas adjacent to it and very far away from America. This is a contest in which China enjoys the inherently decisive advantages of proximity and a defensive mission, which is less resource intensive than power projection. The United States can no more continue to control the near seas of a modernized, powerful China than China or any other foreign nation can hope to control the seas offshore the United States. Already, U.S. forces are being pushed back to firing positions outside the so-called First Island chain. Second, China's neighbors want American help to hedge against Chinese power, even as they strive to reach an accommodation with China. But the rebalance does not enlist these neighbors in a coherent effort to either balance or engage China, and it doesn't aggregate their strength to that of the United States to either end. If America is prepared to take on the task of balancing China's military power pretty much on our own, why should China's smaller neighbors make much effort to do so? If America is prepared to go to war with China over disputes these smaller neighbors espouse, but are themselves unprepared to address militarily, why should they seek to settle these disputes or even exercise caution in their quarrels with China? If reliance on U.S. deterrent power leaves these neighbors with no perceived need to do anything but hang tough on territorial claims, what alternative to coercive measures is available to China? The most egregious instance of this sort of moral hazard is the Philippines, but it's apparent in Japan and South Korea as well. Today's intra-Asian disputes are a pointed reminder that the war Thucydides wrote about was catalyzed by the quarrels of allies of Sparta and Athens, Megara and Corinth, not by disputes directly between those two great powers. And perhaps it's also relevant to note that the less risk-averse and more belligerent of the two was Athens, the democracy, not Sparta, the autocracy. Third, the military antagonism inherent in the rebalance and the inevitable Chinese counters it evokes skew the overall U.S.-China relationship toward zero-sum competition. This entails major opportunity costs. For example, rather than focusing on building frameworks to serve common interests like the protection of commercial shipping in the heavily trafficked South China Sea, the rebalance promotes the planning of naval maneuvers, blockades, and other forms of warfare there. Rather than facilitating the peaceful resolution of territorial disputes by the claimants, it embeds these disputes in Sino-American rivalry and promotes their militarization. Rather than working together to reform or replace outmoded international financial institutions and practices, it presumes that China and America are at cross purposes, and so forth. Some degree of military wariness between the United States and China is both natural and prudent, but active antagonism is unnecessary and damaging to both. The U.S. and Chinese armed forces each have a mission to sustain a peaceful order in the space between us. We need to focus on how to build and buttress stability in the Indo-Pacific region based on the independence and territorial integrity of its smaller states, not the hegemony of the United States, China, or both. Stability requires a balance in the region grounded in its smaller states' prosperity and power of self-defense, supplemented by, not replaced by, the power of the United States and/or others, including China and Japan. It demands an emphasis on the resolution of disputes rather than efforts to freeze them unresolved and ever ready to explode through military deterrence. And it necessitates the parallel pursuit of common interests and opportunities by the United States and China, not just efforts by each side separately to mitigate misperceptions and avoid potential conflicts. That's my comment.
Well, thank you very much. And when anybody who has a written statement, if you leave it with us, put them on our webpage, and if there's a chance to correct any mistakes. They said Israeli-American are particularly good. The mistake we made in this case. I understand that our Chinese colleagues who are on the panel have not joined us at the front. Since now Bonnie Glazer is not going to be able to join us, so use Michael.
What about State? Are you not going to speak?
What state? State. Wait. Mr. Roy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ambassador Roy, please.
I don't want to preempt our Chinese colleagues. Very briefly, I agree with Professor Allison. I think the Thucydides trap is real, and it's rooted in the fact that human nature drives human behavior, and there is a natural pattern of action and reaction when you have the fear and concern that a rising power generates on the part of established powers. And we have seen this dynamic repeatedly throughout history, and we are seeing it in U.S.-China relations at the present time. To break out of the trap, clearly you have to find a way to behave unconventionally, because if you behave conventionally, Professor Allison's research suggests there's a 75% chance that you end up in conflict. And the exceptions are worth studying, as well as the examples which he cites in his behavior. A good example of this is China develops what we call anti-access area denial capabilities. We come up with an air-sea battle concept designed to deal with that. Or as the Chinese say, 你有政策,我有对策. In other words, that's the natural pattern. You have a policy, I have a counter policy. That's the way humans behave, and it creates the Thucydides trap. So the question is, how do you break out of it? Is unconventional behavior possible? Of course. We would never have gotten the turnaround in the Cold War through the breakthrough in U.S.-China relations back in 1971-72 through conventional behavior. And because it was unconventional behavior by both China and the United States, nobody foresaw it coming. And yet it happened and it worked. Another example, you could argue, is the formation of the European Union. Very unconventional behavior for countries actually to give up important aspects of sovereignty in order to create a union which has certainly been far from perfect, but has helped to stabilize Europe and avoid the constant conflict that marked earlier periods. And I also cite Deng Xiaoping's statement that China and Japan should set aside territorial disputes and focus on joint development. Very unusual for a national leader to say, let's set aside a territorial dispute. It's too complicated for us to solve in this generation, and yet it opened up 25 years of rapid expansion of Chinese-Japanese relations. So unconventional behavior can work, but humans, by their nature, tend to think conventionally. And so therefore, I think we need to understand that. But there's some other thoughts I would just quickly put out. First, both sides should steer clear of worst-case assumptions about the other's military strategy. It would be self-defeating for China to persist in a strategy that alienates it from its neighbors and gives incentives to them to strengthen security ties with outside powers such as the United States. And it would be equally self-defeating for the United States to try to pursue a containment strategy against China, because China's neighbors want to cooperate with China. They don't want to be part of a containment strategy. And so therefore both sides need to stop thinking that the other's goal is somehow to take worst-case actions against them. But again, it's hard to steer clear of that. Secondly, we should not assume that China can somehow dominate East Asia. We are now not in an imperial period where you can have a central power and tributary relationships. We live in a Westphalian world in East Asia, where countries are deeply committed to protecting their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Not only do all of the major powers around China not believe it in their interests to see East Asia dominated by one power, China, But the identities of Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar have been formed precisely because they were resistant to being simply absorbed into a Chinese entity. So therefore, thinking of our strategy as necessary to prevent domination of Asia by East Asia, by China, strikes me as unrealistic. Third, I think we ought to bear in mind the probabilities of hot war scenarios with China are low. Professor Allison referred to the fact that we're nevertheless going to spend billions of dollars getting ready for hot war scenarios. The same factors that inhibited the United States and the Soviet Union from engaging in hot war with each other apply in the case of China. We each can inflict unacceptable damage on the homelands of the others, and we can't control escalation if you start down that road. If China takes out a U.S. carrier group using its missiles, it loses cities on the mainland, we lose some cities on our mainland. That's the sort of path that you can't go down. And so therefore, let's think of the realistic scenario, which can be proxy wars, minor clashes, things of this sort. These are the issues that we really need to stabilize. Fourth, the United States should not think that we have to deal with security challenges in East Asia on our own. And yet I frequently see Americans act in talking about security as though Japan doesn't exist. Japan has enormous air and naval capabilities, and as long as Japan feels threatened in the same way that the United States feels threatened, the United States has to factor that into our defense planning, but it's much broader than that, because all of the countries in East Asia in some way or another are part of this equation. And each country, China and the United States, needs to find the best way to try to capture that dynamic. And at the moment, in my judgment, the dynamic works in the U.S. favor, because countries around China want to cooperate when China behaves responsibly, and they turn to the United States when they think China is behaving irresponsibly. And that's a dynamic that if the United States diplomacy in East Asia can capture it, will help to encourage responsible behavior by China, which will help steer us away from the Thucydides trap. Fifth, we need to integrate more tightly our defense and diplomatic strategies for East Asia. That applies to China, it applies to the United States. For example, President Xi Jinping, in a speech not long ago, openly talked about the security dilemma. In his words, we cannot have security for one country and insecurity for other countries. We cannot have security for one group of countries and insecurity for another group of countries. In other words, he was specifically addressing the security dilemma, which is if you are totally secure, other countries are totally insecure. And yet, if you look at the Chinese white paper on military strategy issued in May, you don't find any reflection of that understanding. And if you read U.S. defense documents, they talk about the United States needing to retain air and sea dominance. That amounts to ignoring the security dilemma. To get a stable U.S. PRC balance in East Asia, we have to have less than dominance, and China has to have limits on how far it wants to push its ability to defend itself. At the moment, in my judgment, neither country is integrating their diplomatic and military strategies, and that is a major flaw in our approaches. Six, we need to give greater attention to organizational arrangements. In my judgment, Europe made a fundamental strategic error, with the United States being part of that error, by failing in the goal of trying to integrate Russia into Western Europe organizational structures. They gave him a place at the table as an outsider, and they pursued a strategy that observers at the time and subsequently predicted with great accuracy was going to lead in confrontation with Russia. They also predicted with great accuracy that we would blame the confrontation on Russia. And yet the root of the problem was our pursuing policies which Russia saw as unacceptably threatening to them. pick up your paper, Putin is the devil. That was exactly what George Kennan and many others over 20 years ago predicted was going to happen, and yet we see it happening. So in East Asia, there are lots of talk shops. There are not so many organizational structures in which China is embedded in an institutional arrangement that will inhibit irresponsible behavior. President Xi Jinping has talked about creating new security and cooperation architecture in Asia and in Asia and the Pacific. Americans ought to liberate our minds. Is there some type of regional architecture that would help to stabilize strategic rivalry in East Asia on top of the existing alliance relationships? Because the only existing organization for security and cooperation is in Europe. It emerged during the Cold War alongside the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and it survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and continues to play a productive role in East Asia. So I will end on that point. I think the Thucydides trap is real. Our leaders are paying lip service to the concept of dealing with it, but in practice, they are not addressing the underlying sources of the rivalry. And I think that's something that we all need to try to increase the understanding of the policymakers on how to deal with that problem.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Roy. I just want to add one line to the point that there are no proper institutional arrangements to incorporate China into the kind of international organization we hope for. If you go to the Communitarian Network webpage, you find a little study which shows what happened when China did try to increase its role in the International Monetary Fund, in the World Bank, and in WTO. In each case, all kind of roadblocks were thrown in its way, which farther sent in the road which you just, I think, correctly pointed to. Who are Chinese panelists? Excuse me. The gentleman from China was supposed to be on the panel, do you know? No. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know you personally, so I'm delighted.
My name is not Liu Qiang.
He's not Liu Qiang. He's standing in for me.
He will say what Goodwood said.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something?
Please.
Just several comments. First, I think Campbell's.
Maybe tell people who you are.
Oh, yeah. My name is Zhang Tuosheng from China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies, which is a think tank located in Beijing. So several comments. I think Campbell's speech is better than I think what he could say. So he stressed 2 points. The first is pivot to Asia is the policy of U.S. And the second, he said, strengthen the military alliance is very, very important. Third, he said, mutual restraints. The last one, he said, U.S. and Japan, China's relationship is very important. So should joint all this. So, but it's better than I imagine. But I agree more about Chess Freeman's point that I think U.S. really paid too much attention on the military side, just the military presence and strengthen military alliance. So, of course, China has a lot of concern about that. So I really hope that I also think Edison's point is very important. Yes, there is the possibility of Thucydides trap, but we should have confidence that we can avoid falling into this trap, because the international environment is totally from before. And the relationship between China is totally different from that between China and the former Soviet Union. So we should have confidence to avoid it. But if we have a misunderstanding, misjudgment, we could fear it. So we depend on the both countries' leaders' wisdoms, strategic wisdoms. We need to focus on common interest, have more cooperation. Also, we should strengthen the capability of difference and crisis management. It's very, very important. Finally, I agree, Royce, what he has said. We mustn't start our policy from the worst case scenario, because now in both countries, a lot of people have this kind of worst case scenario to regard the other side as a potential, not enemy, but adversary. So it's dangerous. So we must, especially for the military, they could prepare for the worst case scenario. But at the same time, for the political leaders, for the economic leaders, they should start from the best case scenario, and what is the more possible scenario. So this is very important. Otherwise, we could fall into the trap if we start from the worst case scenario. Finally, I want to say is the territory disputes is a challenge in this region. How to deal with this? I really support General Pan's point, that is, China has capability to solve all these disputes by peaceful negotiation and by joint development, a lot of things. Because we have solved this problem, most of the land disputes, so we can have the capability to solve the maritime disputes by peaceful talks and the COC, a lot of things. So I really hope U.S. not take side. Yeah. If U.S. take side, it's only make the situation more complicated. And finally, I want to say Roy's point is very, very important. We need security, a multilateral security architecture in this region. So the six-party talks and some others, we can try our best to develop this talk mechanism, cooperative mechanism into a multilateral architecture. It will play a very important role. Thank you.
That's a wonderful note on which to close our first session. Will you, one more time? I'm sorry. I'm not used to. My apologies.
Professor Elioni said about the names. Well, in China, we don't have many people with the name A and B, but my name to be the last, W. But W, I tell you, in China, there are more than 100 million ones. So there's about at least 100 million Ws there. But here I'm become nameless because I couldn't find my name here, so I thought I don't need to speak anything. Now, first, I want to make a comment about this trap. I find it difficult because I even don't know how to pronounce its name. So about that trap, I have been thinking about it for quite some time. Why our fellow human beings 2,500 years ago had the wisdom to innovate or to create this so-called trap theory. And today, we the human fellow beings, after 2,500 years, we cannot have the wisdom to get away from that trap. I think we should be clever enough or intelligent enough not to fall into that trap. That's I know the trap would be possible if one side or both sides of the so-called rising power or existing power want to do it. But all those people call me ambassador, but I have to tell you, this ambassador is not that ambassador. Ambassador Roy, I know him, but he didn't know me. I'm the ambassador of yesterday, not today. So I'm not speaking as ambassador, as an old citizen in China, enjoy a life of a wild stock, or idling or floating cloud. That's what I'm doing in Beijing. So I'm going to talk about this idea that this trap theory does not apply to China. Some people say you are propaganda. No. The great majority of the people I know, the common folks in China, simply do not believe in such a theory. First, we thought the world is big enough. Not like in the ancient time in Athens and Sparta. There are two small city-states. And to use nasty words, one brick wind on this side, and the other side not only can hear the sound, but even smell it. But today we have a whole world for countries to live together. This is number one. Number two, the Chinese people have chosen a road of peace development. This is not imposed on us by anybody, but chosen by our own people. We thought only by peaceful development, the Chinese people, 1.3 billion, and now almost 1.4 billion people, are going to enjoy a better life. So nobody will be able to change the will of the Chinese people to stick to that road. I know if are not forced, nobody would wish to get from that road. And that's the only road. I thought that the adherence by the 1.4 billion Chinese people to that road would be a great contribution to prevent both China and other countries from falling into that trap. And the other thing I want to emphasize that today's political landscape, there's not just China. It's a simultaneous rising of a group of countries. If one country tried to contain this one today, but you have to try to contain another. Even as super the might of the United States is, but if you try to contain everyone, by the end, you yourself would be exhausted. And you don't need anyone to pull you down from the top of the world. You do it yourself. Thank you.